I've discovered something about Gamergate I've never seen anyone talk about, because I'd forgotten the exact timeline. Yes, Gamergate exploded into waves of online harassment targeted towards women, mainly in the game industry, and outwards from there. But why did that happen? Yes, it was a reaction to one story about a game developer allegedly cheating on their disgruntled ex with a game reviewer, but why this story? Why did this one get so big at this time? There were other things going on. Not only did this play right into the established narrative in gaming spaces that women were inauthentic invaders, but those men were feeling especially insecure in those spaces at that time because there was another meme going around and it was just hitting the mainstream. Have you heard of neckbeards? It was a popular term about a decade ago. It used to describe guys who look like this and this and this. Neckbeard was a term with a negative connotation. Someone who was in gaming spaces, usually a guy who was overweight and unattractive and had poor social skills and alone. This was related to the whole tips fedora, milady kind of thing. In modern terms, they had no riz, they had no drip, but this became an archetype, a stereotype. It wasn't super political, but there were implications they didn't know how to talk to women. I looked at the Google Trends history for those two terms, neckbeard and Gamergate. Neckbeard is blue, Gamergate is red. And it's from the same time. Specifically, as the term neckbeard was mainstreaming, Gamergate spiked out of nowhere as a sharp reaction. I think for a lot of these guys, it was personal, not even really political. They made an insincere cause out of getting back at the women who made fun of them. There was this window of self-awareness into how they didn't have a successful social script or role. They didn't know what to do or how to succeed. They started massing that more and more in messaging about just caring about truth, just caring about ethics in games journalism. But this is where it started. They always hated women, but this was the time where to the month they were especially insecure and hating themselves. And they lashed out. In the time that followed, that veneer of this being about something greater, ethical, political, did grow into what became the alt-right and new conservative movements targeted at young boys. But that's not how it was. At the time, they were just kind of apolitical gamers. And personally, I think right now, after years of pretending this is a political movement, that mask is starting to slip again. And I think these young boys are starting to get fatigued from pretending to care about political causes. These are new generations now. They don't know why they inherited this. And it's weird. It's artificial. Because the alt-right doesn't really have answers that work, and you can only pretend to care about that so long before you kind of see that, even if they cling to it for some sense of purpose. But the fitness pipeline that feeds into it is really about making yourself attractive and able to get a relationship. And these are reflected in the values of young boys when polled. They want relationships. The gaming pipeline also is more about a fraternal, platonic bonding with friends. Groypers are torn right now because they could stay pure to these ideologies first, or they could give some of that up and then make new friends and connections and get more positive social feedback by appealing to the more mainstream Charlie Kirk audience. And it's kind of seeming like they'll lean toward the latter. It reminds me how in 2023 and 2024, there was a subset of mostly younger women on platforms like TikTok and Instagram who would be woke, but to them, they never really understood or cared or stood for anything. It was just a phase, an aesthetic, something to be a part of, who have now completely flipped and started being conservatives to be a part of current thing, which is why we're seeing a lot of them who pretended to be like trans or non-binary or queer without explaining why for like 2 or 3 months tops, and now they're just openly transphobic and envy-phobic and homophobic because they never really understood or cared what that meant and never really thought it was a real thing because it wasn't a real thing to them. Now they're dyeing their hair blonde and getting lip fillers and are awful to LGBT people. The right is trying to salvage their wave of new young boys who fell into their ideology over basic bigotry by trying to pull them into a greater evangelical Christian recruitment thing. That's not really working. That to me feels like a phase 2. And they're not even good at pretending on that one. I think there's a significant unrecognized contingent of really basic apolitical people who are happy to adopt political causes if it helps them gain a sense of acceptance or bludgeon people who they feel deny them that. They are happy to do this at the expense of the BIPOC community, of women and feminism, of the LGBTQIA+ community, and now apparently conservative Christians. And I'm starting to realize that the American left has been duped for the past decade, 10, 15 years, into debating these high-level social, political, philosophical ideas and topics like feminism or LGBTQIA plus rights, or I guess now something about Christianity, with people who are just BSing why they actually said they cared. And even though they never really cared, these incel neckbeards and their descendants have left lasting damages on feminist discourse, on women's spaces, on trans spaces, on non-binary spaces. And I'm very concerned now for the safety of Black spaces. And the more I read, the more I learn, the more I'm realizing the whole culture war period of the last 15 years is a repeating pattern of people on the left being pulled into high-level topic debates for different groups' rights against a right wing who's really just more concerned with their own personal, typically white male insecurities and loneliness. And we're having two different conversations and having just the same argument in a million different forms, while tons of different actually marginalized groups catch strays. How much of this started because a now previous generation of men felt embarrassed and made fun of on the internet and didn't know what to do with those feelings and were too scared to admit that it hurt? How much of politics online has ever actually been about politics? I think it's way less than I thought. Through this framing, I'm completely reevaluating my understanding of the culture war, and I think it makes a little more sense. It's been obvious for decades that lots of our cool cultural quirks, like language and slang, comes from typically Black marginalized queer communities, and then floats up through like white gay communities, and then Black straight communities, and then merges back kind of into the mainstream as like basic white girls hear about it, where it's like slay. But I think there's a different tide also, where young, very online white boys are making up their own words in these tight-knit communities, and their language and ideas are trickling down the other direction into the mainstream politics, even though it largely starts as subcultural communication for the sake of social bonding. And they're so far removed from women and minorities that they don't mind dropping in slurs or bigoted language. And when it hits the mainstream, it's seen as more authentically political than it was ever meant to be. So where I used to see the culture wars as a series of different social political issues, where the left position towards inclusion is morally and scientifically correct and explicable through data, where any shortcomings are just rhetorical, instead this whole period is 0-1 in favor of the right, where we've been misidentifying a singular cause that we have failed to address. Young boys need better social emotional education, and may feel isolated, lost, and hurt, but will never directly, openly say that to an outsider, especially women. And the more of a left diverse minority you or I are, the less we're understanding what they're actually saying, because we're linguistically apart. How often are they actually principled anything? And how often are they just neckbeards lashing out? I think this is actually the fire keeping the bubbling cauldron of internet reactionary movements alive. I think we just missed the source. The harm is very real and tremendous. This amounts to crime, but I don't think we have tackled the motive because it keeps happening. And I think this might be a key.